Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. It has certainly been an interesting time in the news, to say the least, and sometimes it's helpful to look backward before going forward so we can truly understand the moment in which we're living. And we're going to do that a little bit today by revisiting some of the conversations we've had with one journalist. Her name is Leah Sottile. She is the host of the Bundyville podcast from Oregon Public Broadcasting and Long Reads. That podcast started after the Malheur National Wildlife occupation in 2016, and it brought us through 2 seasons of examining the anti-government movement in the West and the Pacific Northwest. We talked with Leah in August of 2019 to talk about the second season of Bundyville and how it was relevant to the region. You ended the first season of the podcast and the series on this idea that there's kind of something coming in the anti-government movement. Malheur might have just kicked it off and there's going to be like a chapter 2. But I got the feeling that it wasn't necessarily like another big incident or event, like another occupation, another Waco, another Oklahoma City bombing. What exactly was it? Maybe was it something bigger about extremism becoming more mainstream? What is the next thing?
Yeah, I think you're hitting it right on the head. At the end of the first season, we sort of take the listener to a place where there could be potential for another standoff with the government, because that's what the Patriot movement is always looking for, sort of other ways to fight with the government or to egg them on and to continue this kind of continual cycle of tit for tat between the government and the anti-government movement. But with this season, we really kind of unpack this idea that extremist ideologies are being repeated by mainstream politicians, by local politicians, all the way up to the federal government. So what does it mean when all of a sudden the anti-government movement is a part of the government? So that's what you're right. That's where we go with this season is trying to understand what changes when extremist ideologies become slightly more mainstream.
So a significant portion of this season looks at the anti-government movement, especially in the inland Northwest, and how white supremacy is attached to that. People, of course, will remember that the Aryan Nation was very present in the inland Northwest, particularly North Idaho, for many years, but that kind of went away after they were bankrupted and they left their compound in Hayden, north of Coeur d'Alene. But it seems that you're kind of saying that it's still there, it's always been there, just maybe less prominent. They're not doing marches down the downtown Coeur d'Alene anymore, but they're still very much there. Is that what you found?
I think so. I mean, in the podcast, we give the example of when I still lived in Spokane in 2011, a white supremacist from Stevens County placed a bomb that could have killed and injured tons of people on the parade route of the Martin Luther King Jr. parade. So that person was directly connected with white supremacist groups, had white supremacist ideologies. So that was one example. But I think that one of the biggest takeaways that I would hope people see from this season, from the story and the podcast, is that white supremacy doesn't look the same that it always has. You can't sort of flatten who white supremacists are and say, well, they always, have swastika flags and they always have KKK hoods on and burning crosses. I think that is a really reductive way of looking at racists and white supremacists. And so you have to look at ideology to see how the ideologies of Richard Butler and the Aryan Nations live on through other institutions and people in the Northwest.
Over the past year, as we've seen protests for various reasons, including against coronavirus safety measures and for racial justice, we've heard names of groups like Antifa become more prominent. They've been in the news and on the lips of politicians. Leah has covered some groups on the political left, right, and in between for several years, and we talked with Leah in June of 2020 about what Antifa is and is not. A lot of people have heard the name Antifa. It supposedly means anti-fascist. But from your perspective, what or really who is Antifa?
Antifa is, like you said, it's just shorthand for anti-fascist. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what people who are Antifa or anti-fascists are. And a lot of that comes from in the past 4 years, we've seen tons of protests happening in places like Portland, where I live, where Antifa is sort of rumbling in the streets with Proud Boys and these sort of of far right people. What I've come to learn in covering those things is that Antifa can take all sorts of shades of look and feel. Anybody who's opposed to fascism is anti-fascist. And a lot of times people think that Antifa are these people dressed in all black with, a black face mask and black clothing and busting up windows and getting into fights. In some interviews that I have done with anti-fascist groups, they talk about that as called black bloc. That's the term for that style of clothing. Black bloc is just 1% of the anti-fascist movement. And that is used as a tactic by anti-fascists to protect normal, everyday anti-fascist protesters. So that's how it's framed. I think that in the media, there's been a lot of portrayal of, these people getting in fights and things like that. I think that really it is just sort of this kind of very small group that is committing violence, but that's what's being picked up on to sort of propagate these rumors that these vans full of Antifa are coming to your town to destroy things, which have been wholeheartedly disproven.
And there were other names of groups in the news this last year, such as the Proud Boys. Those are names that we heard about throughout the summer during protests for racial justice and heard again in early January after the mob attack on the U.S. Capitol following the November election. We talked with Leah at the same time about some of these groups that we're hearing more and more in the news. I just wonder if you could draw some distinctions between those groups and provide some of the background on what those groups really are.
So the Proud Boys are one that you hear a lot of people kind of group these people together as all Proud Boys. Proud Boys, generally, they're, neo-fascists. It's an all-male organization. They perceive anything that's politically correct or that expresses some sort of white guilt as something that they want to fight against, and quite literally fight against. So like in Portland in the last 4 years, we've seen lots of these Proud Boy groups coming to town to just sort of oppose this rampant liberalism. In 3%ers and militia groups, they are similar but different. They have anti-government ideologies. This name 3% is conspiracy theory that people who belong to the group believe in. They believe that it only took 3% of American colonists to fight off the British during the American Revolution, which is, wholeheartedly disproven. Both groups, I think, are often called white nationalist groups, but that is pretty reductive in that there are many people of color that are Proud Boys, many people of color who are 3%ers. However, they sort of stand on ideas that, again, are like rebranded ideas that come from white nationalist movements or, neo-Nazi talking points and things like that. Boogaloo, again, is a new term that I guess I never thought I would have to learn a lot about, but here we are. Boogaloo boys, as they're often called, are people who want to see chaos happen, who would like to see a civil war. So whereas Proud Boys and 3%ers might be the sorts of people who would the Proud Boys aggressively want to push this male-centric society. 3%ers are saying, we're going to be ready when something happens in society that is, some big cataclysm. Boogaloo Boys would like to incite that. So we've seen over the last week several instances of Boogaloo Boys showing up at either Black Lives Matter protests or getting into confrontations with police officers and killing police officers in some instances as a way of trying to just sort of wreak havoc and chaos. The end game there is really sort of like nihilism instead of like a refounding of society.
So I just wonder what your sense of like someone like Ammon Bundy and his followers in that sort of ideology, how they might feel about large state and federal police forces in this moment.
Yeah, well, specifically, I've looked at some of the things that Ammon Bundy has been talking about on his social media, and he's absolutely, seeing this as a moment that he can say, yeah, I agree. I think that the police have way too much power. Look at what the amount of force they brought on us at Bundy Ranch. They often point to the, 2016 Malheur occupation and the death of Lavoy Finicum as another instance of police force overreach. It's a little bit opportunistic, I think, to capitalize on this moment. But, if the Bundys are nothing but opportunists in a lot of my reporting. So I think that is one distinction. But however, if you look at the long history of the Patriot movement, and a lot of people who've adhered to this, you've got under that umbrella of the Patriot movement sovereign citizens, who are people who very actively oppose police and any kind of law enforcement, and there are multiple times in history that they have gotten into large shootouts with police officers for very simple things like a driver's license or a license plate. So within the Patriot movement, it's hard to cast it with a broad brush, because there are people who are very pro law enforcement, pro Trump, things like that. Ammon Bundy is not those things. So this is just to say there's a lot of nuance in it.
Those are just some of the conversations we've had with journalist Leah Sottile in the past several years. You can see more of her work from the Bundyville podcast and the conversations that we've had on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.